Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a key moment of the Cold War, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's a story full of tension, poor decision-making, and international consequences. To understand why the US launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, we need to step back into the late 1950s and the broader context of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union were in the middle of a fierce ideological battle. The US promoted democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union pushed for communism and socialism. Both superpowers were trying to expand their spheres of influence, and this global competition played a huge role in shaping international events, especially in places like Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a successful revolution against Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Castro's overthrow of Batista marked a dramatic shift in Cuba's political landscape. Initially, many in the US had mixed feelings about Castro. He was a revolutionary who had ousted a corrupt dictator, but the US government quickly became suspicious when Castro began aligning himself with the Soviet Union. Castro's embrace of communism and his nationalization of key industries, many of which were owned by American companies, led to growing tensions between the US and Cuba. By 1960, the US had imposed economic sanctions on Cuba, and the stage was set for conflict. In short, Castro's Cuba was a threat to US interests in the Western Hemisphere, and the US government saw him as an enemy in the global struggle between communism and democracy. Enter the Eisenhower administration. Before he left office in January 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower approved a covert plan to overthrow Castro. The plan involved training Cuban exiles to invade the island and spark a popular uprising against Castro's government. This operation was called Operation Pluto, and its goal was to replace Castro with a government more friendly to the United States. The CIA, which was already involved in covert operations around the world, took charge of organizing the invasion. They recruited Cuban exiles who had fled the island after the revolution, many of whom were bitter toward Castro's communist regime. The plan was to land these exiles in Cuba, provide them with support, and hope that the Cuban people would rise up and join them to overthrow Castro. In early 1961, the Kennedy administration came into power. Although John F. Kennedy was initially briefed on the operation, it was the new president's decision to move forward with it. This was a key moment because, although Kennedy had doubts about the plan, he ultimately gave the green light to the invasion. He wanted to show strength against the growing communist threat in the Western Hemisphere, and he felt pressured by the political situation and the growing fear of communism spreading in Latin America. The plan was fairly straightforward. A force of around 1,500 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, would invade the southern coast of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs. The idea was to land, secure a beachhead, and rally the Cuban people to rise up against Castro. The CIA even thought that Castro's military might not respond quickly enough to the invasion, and that the US would have the opportunity to quickly support the exiles with their strikes to neutralize any counterattacks. The CIA had hoped for a quick victory. They believed that if the exiles could land, establish a foothold, and create the perception of a popular uprising, it would send shockwaves through Cuba, possibly even forcing Castro to flee. But this assumption was flawed from the start. On April 17, 1961, the invasion was launched. But right from the beginning, things started to go wrong. The landing site at the Bay of Pigs, a remote area along Cuba's southern coast, was not as isolated as the CIA had hoped. Castro's forces were more prepared than expected. The Cuban military quickly mobilized, and within hours, the exiles were under heavy fire. One of the major miscalculations of the invasion was the lack of air support. To make matters worse, there was a lack of coordination between the Cuban exiles on the ground and the CIA's support operations. The exiles were left isolated, unable to secure the beachhead and unable to make significant progress inland. The U.S. had expected the Cuban people to rise up against Castro once the exiles landed, but this didn't happen. Castro's support among the Cuban population, while not unanimous, was strong enough to quell any hopes of a popular revolt. Castro's government had spent years building its own defense system and controlling the narrative, making it harder for any anti-Castro groups to gain traction. The international community was also watching closely. The Soviet Union, which had been backing Castro since he took power, quickly offered support to the Cuban government. Meanwhile, the U.S. was facing significant international criticism for trying to intervene in the affairs of a sovereign nation, especially given the secrecy and lack of transparency surrounding the operation. The U.S. government was also put in a tough spot. While Kennedy had approved the invasion, the failure of the operation meant that the U.S. had to manage the fallout. As the invasion began to unravel, Kennedy faced a massive political crisis. Despite the fact that the U.S. had little direct involvement once the invasion started, Kennedy's decision to approve the mission made him personally responsible for the failure. By April 19th, just 2 days after the invasion began, the Cuban forces had overwhelmed the exiles. The invasion had failed miserably, and the exiles were either killed or captured. The U.S. government had to admit that its covert operation was a disaster. The failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion was an embarrassment for Kennedy and a significant blow to American prestige, especially in the midst of the Cold War, but there were deeper consequences as well. Castro's position in Cuba was strengthened. The U.S. had attempted to overthrow his government, and he used this as a rallying point to solidify his power. He also strengthened his alliance with the Soviet Union, leading to a tighter relationship that would have dramatic consequences just over a year later during the Cuban Missile Crisis. For Kennedy, the failure of the invasion marked a turning point in his presidency. He had to deal with the political fallout, but it also shaped how he approached U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and the broader Cold War. Kennedy learned a hard lesson about the dangers of relying on covert operations without a clear and realistic plan for success. So, what lessons can we take from the Bay of Pigs invasion? For one, it showed the danger of overconfidence in intelligence and assumptions about how a population will respond to a foreign-backed invasion. The CIA's plan was overly optimistic and didn't fully account for the realities on the ground in Cuba. Secondly, it revealed the complexities of Cold War geopolitics. The U.S. was so focused on the threat of communism in Cuba that it overlooked the possibility that the Cuban people, and especially Castro, would fight back harder than anticipated. The Bay of Pigs invasion also deepened the Cold War divide, making the Soviet Union more committed to defending Cuba. To wrap up, the Bay of Pigs invasion remains a powerful lesson in the dangers of military intervention without a clear strategy, the importance of understanding local politics, and the unintended consequences of covert operations. It didn't just fail, it backfired. Kennedy's reputation took a hit, Castro's regime survived, and the U.S. was forced to reassess its approach to Latin America. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Bay of Pigs invasion, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe for more historical content, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, keep learning and keep questioning history.